Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to SERCAL 2020, SERCAL's 27th annual conference, Shedding Light in Challenging Times. So this is SERCAL's first virtual conference, and we'll be meeting every Tuesday, Thursday during the month of September. We'll have a webinar style conference. We'll meet at 1 p.m. and sessions will go about 2 to 3 hours. And traditionally, we all come together, we gather together in person. This photo here is in 2019 in Santa Barbara, where we had about 300 people in attendance. And somehow this year in 2020, we have to gather together virtually. So it's on with the show. We are going to continue getting together so we can continue sharing and advancing the art and science of ecological restoration. So thanks for showing up, everybody. It looks like we have 79 people participating right now, and I know we have about 200 people registered for our conference, and the number keeps going up, so we're at 83 already. So we got a stacked schedule for you for this month of September. Starting today, September 1st, we have a session on managing invasive plants, and we also have a plenary speaker today with Bruce Delgado. Thursday, we'll be meeting on grassland ecosystems. Next week, we have sessions on restoration for wildlife and a technology session called Landsat, drones, and ferries. And then the third week of September, we'll be talking about green spaces and trails, and continue our conversation with grassland ecosystems. And then the final week in September, we'll have a session where we're looking back at our mistakes called Hindsight is 2020. And our final session is the second session for restoration for wildlife. So we have over 40 presentations in all, and I hope you can make all of them, if not at least some of them. I want to give a great big thank you to all our session chairs and plenary speaker who are volunteering their time and being so thoughtful about how their session's going to go. So thanks to you guys, and we'll be meeting these folks as we go on with the conference. Want to give a big thanks out to our sponsors for their continued support, especially during these challenging times. So our Golden Opportunity sponsors this year are HT Harvey and Associates, SWICA, SNS Seeds, ICF, Balance Hydrologics, Burleson Consulting, Westervelt, Dudek, HRS, Wildlands, Marin Municipal Water District, and Rocky Mountain Bioproducts. That's a mouthful, it's a lot of them, and we thank you for your support. Also want to thank our Silver Lining sponsors with Cal IPSI and California Native Grassland Association and the Watershed Nursery, CBEC, NHC, UCI, and WRA. Thank you. And a shout out to our folks, our individuals and firms who sponsored students with a conference scholarship. I know there are over 20 scholarships out there, and so that means there's over 20 students attending our conference for free. So thank you for leaving the door open to our next generation of restoration ecologists and researchers and practitioners. Today's session, we have a special sponsor host with Burleson Consulting, which is a woman-owned small business. And Kevin Gallenbohr from Burleson has pre-recorded a video clip telling us more about Burleson.
Greetings, SERCAL. My name is Kevin Gallenbohr, Principal Scientist with Burleson Consulting. Burleson is a small woman-owned business with office locations in Folsom and Monterey, California, with capabilities working throughout the state of California. We are what we call puzzle masters with a full suite of multidisciplinary environmental services. Our firm specializes in habitat restoration, utility projects, and abandoned mine lands. We're happy to continue to support SERCAL and hope that you guys enjoy the remainder of the conference.
Great. Thanks for recording that, Kevin. And after today's session, there will be a meet and greet with Burleson Consulting. So if you're interested in chatting with staff from Burleson, please stay on after today's session, and we will promote you from attendee to a panelist so we can go to a Zoom-like meet and greet. One more item here before we start today's session. Webinar house rules, recommendations, and reminders. So panelists, please mute and hide your videos unless you're presenting. And attendees, you are automatically muted or hidden. There is a chat feature. It's optional. So if you want to chat with everyone at the conference, you have that choice. Please treat everyone how you would like to be treated. I personally like to keep that feature turned off. I find it distracting when I'm listening to a presentation. If you have formal questions for the presenter or the session chair, please use the Q&A feature, and the presenter or moderator will answer your questions during breaks or at the end of their presentation. They'll do their best to get to all your questions, but may not have time for everything. And one last thing, the webinar will be recorded, and we'll make this recording available to you in the future. We'll send you an email with a link. And on that note, I would like to bring Bruce Delgado to the virtual stage. Bruce is our plenary speaker and our session chair for managing invasive plants. Hi there, Bruce.
Hello.
Bruce has been working with the Bureau of Land Management since 1988, and in 1993, he took an assignment as a botanist at Fort Ord Public Lands, which is now known as Fort Ord National Monument. And I was fortunate enough back in 1998 to get an internship with BLM at Fort Ord through both BLM and the Watershed Institute at CSU Monterey Bay. So I got to spend the summer with Bruce one year and hanging out, smashing weeds and talking about habitat restoration and attending my first ever SERCAL conference and CalIPSI conferences, which was great. It was very inspirational for me. I learned tons, and I've been so privileged to have Bruce as a mentor for me for the last 22 years. And I know he hasn't just touched me, he's touched many of us in our field of work. So I know many of you know of Bruce, have worked with Bruce. And if you haven't worked with Bruce, I'm really happy to bring Bruce to the stage today. He has a lot to share, and he's a great resource for all of us. So without further ado, my good friend Bruce and habitat restoration legend, Bruce Delgado. Thanks, Bruce.
All right. Thank you very much, Thor. It's been great to know you and so many people that are in this restoration field and that are on this call today. Thanks everybody for joining the event. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Thor, I'm ready to share my screen. It says I have to wait a bit. Okay.
Yep.
Well, all right. Welcome everyone to this SERCAL 2020 kickoff presentation. I think we're all fortunate to do what we do, but these are tough times. And so trying to keep it real and keep it in real time, I think we have to recognize pandemics and social unrest, economic recessions and climate change. They're all stressors to our jobs, our work budgets, our personal lives. And our creativity and our enhanced partnerships on personal and on professional levels can help us do a better job as a team to help our wildlands on which all of our lives depend. Part one of this presentation is about us, and part two is about our profession with lots of overlap. Part one is a 10-minute attempt to dive personally into the social unrest in our country. My intent is not to offend anyone, but to engage us in a meaningful process to help our restoration industry grow and include more slices of America in our fields of science and conservation. SERCAL has recognized that our restoration industry is affected by systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. My job in the next 9 minutes is to address in part one what this means. And the first concept I'd like to discuss is in regards to the creativity and partnerships on the personal level of our trusted five. Outside of your family, who are the 5 most trusted allies in your life? Just think about that. Are they diverse, or do they think like you? Do they share similar backgrounds and social identities? My trusted 5 are not diverse, and that's been comfortable for me, but it's something that I would like to change. This is a deep dive into who I am and who you all are. How we feel of ourselves is often with some of these most common identities. Unconsciously or not, we may feel proud of being in some groups and ashamed of being in others. This is personal and highly subjective. You get to fill it out any way that feels accurate for you on your own time. You may check some boxes in the dominant, others in the marginalized columns. Depends on how you've experienced life. My family was terrorized when I was young for being a Mexican family. I learned then I was Mexican, and that some thought I was second class because of that. I believed it, along with criticisms or misinformation that I heard about this and other of my identities in the marginalized column. I also feel superior or somewhat righteous or entitled because of other identities I have that I think are dominant in our society. A major point here is that if you're aware you feel proud or ashamed for any of your identities, you can start to have empathy for others who feel the same for their identities. I get a laugh out of what a friend told me recently, that some people with dominant identities think they hit a triple to have these identities, when in reality, they were born on third base with these identities. This discussion has been a build-up to racism and internalized oppression. The next 2 slides are the most important for me to understand Black Lives Matter movement on a personal level. Racism is a system of beliefs and behaviors that assumes the superiority of one ethnicity over another. Conscious or unconscious, implicit, explicit, they result in the oppression, usually of people of color, for the benefit of the dominant group. A simpler definition for racism is racial prejudice plus power equals racism. So if I'm a Caucasian, I think I'm superior to Mexicans, and I have the power to purposefully not hire Mexicans, and I don't hire them because they're Mexican. That would be racism by this simpler definition. Internalized oppression or internalized dominance is huge for me. I recently realized how much it's driven my psyche all my life, and I didn't even know what it was. For me, it's how I've been affected internally by being treated as second class for being Mexican. The internalized impact is that I believed this misinformation and I undervalued myself and other Mexicans. But the worst part about this may be how internalized oppression and dominance affects how I undervalue and maybe mistreat other marginalized groups about which I've also received misinformation, such as women, African Americans, physically, emotionally disabled, non-English speakers, currently homeless, farm workers, old people, overweight people. I experience a disconnect with members of these oppressed groups. Well, this has been pretty isolating for me to not be able to feel close or equal or trusting with the majority of people in my life. I start to understand how African American Black Lives Matter protesters may feel anger and frustration with both racism and their own internalized oppression. I start to understand my own sense of dominant identities and my dominance or my entitlement-related flaws. So you can have racism on an individual or systemic basis. At the individual level, it's beliefs and attitudes of individuals, actions that we take that lead to racism. They can be conscious or unconscious, passive or active, telling a racist joke, or believing in the inherent superiority of one ethnicity can lead to individual racism. Systemic racism is policies, practices that create different results for different racial groups. Institutional policies may never mention a racial group, but their effect is to create advantages for a dominant ethnicity at the disadvantage to a marginalized people. For example, not too long ago, there were government policies that restricted the ability of people to get loans to buy homes in minority neighborhoods. That was known as redlining. The disproportionate use of minority communities for industrial facilities like landfills, power plants, sewage treatment plants, sand mines, oil refineries, that they're placed in minority communities often is a result of systemic racism. Our last concept in this discussion is understanding that terminology is paramount to having meaningful conversation on social justice matters. Diversity, inclusion, equity are each different. They're not synonymous. Diversity exists when your environment includes a variety of working styles, ideas, and experiences being represented by individuals themselves coming from different social identities or cultures. Inclusion boils down to supporting and valuing authentic participation of any individual or group. So if a highly qualified but first African American on your field crew or your management staff quits after 2 months, it's not a failure of diversity. It's perhaps a failure of the inclusiveness of your environment that wasn't well adjusted for people of color to fit in. So how can our creativity lead more young people, more people of color to participate in boards of directors and management leadership positions for natural resource nonprofits and agencies? It may require a disruption of the Eurocentric traditional perspectives that are not shared by marginalized groups or marginalized cultures. My last 2 slides on this Black Lives Matter theme address equity, the fundamental cry behind the recent social unrest in many countries. Equity is fair treatment, access, opportunity, advancement. It's not equality. When implemented effectively, equitable practices dismantle barriers, such as those making it so hard for women and people of color to become leaders of large companies or United States presidents, Supreme Court judges, or more importantly, restoration crew supervisors. Yeah. Equality, on the other hand, is the uniform distribution of resources. Everybody gets the same. In the baseball illustration, the littlest fellow on the left of the 4 boxes, he's given equal resources. He gets a box like everybody else, but he's still left only seeing the wooden board of a fence, while his taller friends have a great view of the game. In an equitable scenario, the littlest fellow would be provided resources needed to participate fully. The third version from the left is the reality perceived by many Black Lives Matter protesters. Ideally, the fence, as on the far right, is a structural barrier that can be taken down, and fan participation would be created equitable for everybody. Unfortunately, if you took down that barrier, you might have too many inside the park home runs, but you'd have equity. All right. I hope this 10-minute dive into racism and dominant and marginalized social identities sparks our creativity to learn more about ourselves and improve our partnerships to bring more of the 8 billion people on the planet into the restoration industry and that of conservation of natural resources, as if our lives and the generations that follow us depend on it. We can't do this with just a sliver of our population. Okay, well, that was a bit intense for me. I don't know about you all, but now we're going to move on to part 2, very different than part 1. This is about creativity and partnerships on a professional level. These are real names for real dirt roads on U.S. Army property, Fort Ord National Monument. The partnership between the Department of Defense and the Department of Interior, which includes the other BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, on this monument of 14,000 acres, has been a love fest of creativity, flexibility, spirited teamwork, and on-the-ground conservation progress. What else would you expect from large bureaucratic agencies, right? Well, we have oodles of fun on Fort Ord, but our serious motive is to welcome all slices of community through the generations for hands-on learning and loving their public land. Here, since the early 1990s, when Fort Ord was slated to become the largest military base in the United States to close. In this photo, the Monterey Bay chapter of California Native Plant Society's field trip is enjoying those flowers so tiny that we've got to get down to their level with a hand lens to appreciate them. The ground muffled oohs and ahs expressed in these moments tell us the public is loving learning. But it takes time for land managers to create and host hundreds of these public weekend explorations, such as this. But these partnerships that are built are long-term and mutually beneficial. BLM and the Army, we do our best to manage for the protection of natural resources between the roads and trails. There's about 120 miles of routes for the public on Fort Ord National Monument, but on the roads and trails, we try to provide as much access as safely possible for as many constituents as possible. And here on the right, you see a Stanford University sponsored road bike race. Alongside that, to the left, you see a mountain bike competition that are the kind that occur annually on Fort Ord. And all of these require permits, staff time, and supervision to avoid impacts to natural resources. Although there's our 440,000 visitors every year to enjoy the monument, there's plenty of space, plenty of time for solitude amidst a beautiful nature, a very beautiful landscape. Here, a former BLM weed intern who became a CSUMB instructor and is now a doctorate student at UC Santa Cruz, John Detka, rides alone in the year 2000, a long time ago. All right, we transition from recreation to creative natural resource management examples of the partnership on Fort Ord. At BLM, our resource management plans marching orders for coastal grasslands include managing those grasslands for increased native bunch grasses, minimized fire hazard, limiting exotics, and increased biodiversity. In this slide, it's Manny Casanova and Allison that are enjoying collecting some data in a graze plot on an east-facing slope that's got some really good forb diversity and some bunch grasses there. It's a really nice photo. From 1997 to 2015, BLM utilized 700 ewes and 600 lamb, whereas the Army had some prior training activity here prior to the 90s and authorized 5,400 sheep, many more than the BLM does. Without the fence control, though, for targeted grazing within pens, sheep would move over large areas looking for what they prefer, forbs, and they tended to avoid the thicker grass, especially on north-facing slopes. Upon the sheep's departure in summer each year, tall grass and high biomass amounts would remain. Small residual grass populations of native poa, melica, festuca, elemis, danthonia, and low native forb concentrations indicated that the higher stocking rates of the past could have reduced the natives' abundance. And that's something that we're trying to turn around. Well, as in everything that we do on Fort Ord, the public were partners to our sheep grazing program. Their acceptance of the sheep grazing and the fact that their dogs killed or injured sheep on occasion required that we provide public education. So we had some creative fun with the sheep. We invited the public this day each year to see how wool was spun into yarn, how sheep were sheared. Sheep owner Erie Artie would speak to the public about the sheep industry. The sheepdogs and the herders would conduct herding demonstrations, and BLM staff would remind people about the sheep benefits and why they were there and why pet dogs were needed to be kept on leash near sheep. One memorable moment of Sheep Appreciation Day was when a band of sheep was spooked by people and some of the lambs jumped atop the hood of a nice BMW parked nearby. Similarly, we've had Dog Appreciation Day, similar message, keep your dogs on leash. But a lot of fun, a lot of dogs, and hopefully a lot of understanding of why we have the rules that we have for responsible visitation by the public on Fort Ord. Now we move to grazing research on Fort Ord. Bacris pilularis, coyote brush, or BOPI for short, was observed during the sheep years to be encroaching and be type converting the grassland to coyote brush scrub. So on the left here in 1998, there's a roughly rectangular 5-acre area where you can see some concentrations of coyote bush and some spattering of coyote bush elsewhere. But then when you move to 2012 in that same 5-acre area, you can see it's largely filled with coyote brush scrub. So that's what we were seeing happening across the landscape, and this was just one example. Here it is up close. The bottom of this valley is that 5-acre rectangle, but if you look to the right up the slope, you can see that it's happening on the slope as well. So about the time we were deciding what to do with the coyote brush encroachment, we had an offer we couldn't refuse to graze goats. The partners here include 2 Peruvian, 1 Mexican goat herder, various herding dogs, and Goats R Us company out of the Bay Area. The BLM oversight helps advise when and where to rotate these 3 different 600 goat herds in their respective winter and spring grazing areas, totaling 2,800 acres. The offloading of these goats, who are the major partner here, is often a hoot to watch when 300 goats per truck get out and leap with joy to be free in new areas with fresh food in abundance. And it's interesting, their favorite foods in priority order seem to be, number 1, lace lichen, followed in preference, acorns, oak leaves, green forbs, green grass, dry forbs, and lastly, dry grass. This seems to be the goat's order of favorite foods, and it's fun to watch them choose what to eat. The herding dogs, as partners, work remarkably hard under difficult conditions, and they intelligently heed the goat herder whistles, their verbal commands, hand signals to steer or reposition the goat herds. And these dogs, they love loving. All right. Now that we've introduced you to the goat grazing partners, what are the results of this partnership? There's been 7 years of data collection and 2 master theses, which have concluded the following. The top arrow summarizes the control results. As you can see, after 7 years without goat grazing, the annual grass and the non-native forbs are the only categories that significantly changed. Yellow font color equals significance. But the coyote bush was the same, the bunch grasses were the same, and the native forbs were the same. So you ended up with coyote brush scrub remaining in those ungrazed control areas that were studied. In the grazed areas that were studied, you had significantly less coyote brush over that 7-year period, same amount of bunch grass, you had more annual grass and more non-native forbs, same amount of native forbs, but overall, with a decrease in the woody and an increase in the herbaceous, you have coyote brush scrub being replaced by coastal grassland, which is what we were hoping we would see. Here's a photo showing both low fuel hazard and healthy native bunch grasses and forbs, the wildflowers. This is what we want, but most of our 2,500 acres of open grassland are dominated by annual non-native grasses. We do have 2 recently initiated studies trying to find creative goat grazing solutions that would move the annual grass cover in these open areas to favor more the native bunch grass and forb diversity. This is part of our marching orders. Well, the creativity we're trying to apply to the use and the research of goats could best be said to be in fluid motion. And Chris Hart, this Thursday at the SERCAL session, will be diving deep into this research. So I hope that you can catch his presentation in a couple of days from now. But with one eye that we have on what we're doing on Fort Ord with goats, we have another eye on what Rodrigo Sierra Corona and his coworkers are doing with Criollo cattle at the San Lucia Conservancy in Carmel Valley. These are relatively small cows that require less water. They do better on poor forage, such as tall, dry grass, than do American Angus cattle. Perhaps the creativity and partnership can result in summer Criollo trials on Fort Ord to reduce our tall summer grass, but that's in the future maybe. We're going to move on to a different kind of habitat restoration. It was 1997, where the creativity of CSU Monterey Bay undergrad Drew Reedy, who was employed at the time by our major restoration partner, Return of the Natives. Drew told BLM that we should have live music at our Saturday volunteer planting events. Well, long story short, we said, that sounds crazy, let's try it. Well, since then, each of our 69 Saturday planting events has been serenaded by live music such as Didgeridoo and Dixieland Jazz. It's been pretty awesome. Here's how we do our restoration. We start with either eroded, degraded roads, helipad sites, or parking lots, something like that nature. And then we bring in bulldozers and we fill them in and we recontour them. This is what it might look like after a month in this case. 2 years after, 7 years after, that was 2007. And now it looks largely the same, although it's actually probably ready for a fire because it's so mature at this point. Another site is a large groove or slot, a gap put in a hillside by every year's bulldozer grading. When the roads rut out and you want to smooth them out after the fall rains, it gets lower and lower. So this is a slot. And we use the same practice, bringing in the materials we need or taking them from on site, plant them after seeding and strawing. And then 10 years later, it looks like this with a little bit of open ground on the left, sorry, on the right. But we're monitoring that in all of our sites for weeds and erosion. And overall, they're doing pretty awesome. So this is a compilation of what we've done over those 23 years. On the right is a map showing in yellow the restored areas over the 7,200 acres that BLM manages on Fort Ord. This is a 6,000 acre piece. This is a 1,200 acre piece with a few acres here at our work center. So in those years of working those 221 sites, we've restored, as you can see, a total of 140 acres of the 7,200 plus that we have on BLM. And those are between these 8 plant communities, habitat types, with the majority of them being maritime chaparral, which is our priority because that's where most of our endangered species of plants occur, is in the maritime chaparral. So it's been a great 23 years, and I think we've got a lot done. We've learned a lot. We've included a lot of people, and this is a photo to end that segment of with our Jalisco harpist playing on Valentine's Day. And at least you can see on the right that one volunteer is enchanted by the whole scenario. So we're going to move to pigs now. They're quite cute when they're little. And from 1993 to 2004, that we were not aware of any history of pigs on Fort Ord. But between 2004 and 2006, they had become common and were damaging our vernal pools. This vernal pool is a place we call Butterfly Valley. It's beautiful with the endangered species of yellow Contra Costa goldfields in it and surrounded by an unusual species of popcorn flower called Hickman's popcorn flower. But this is before pigs, 2004. This is after pigs, same exact site. So we'll go back. This is before, this is after. The pigs have a thick cartilage around their noses that they use to turn over soil, kind of like rototilling. And they consume anything edible, plants, animals that they can find. In this case, it's kind of interesting. There's thousands of wild onion bulbs, and the pigs just love those. So that's one thing that they're eating there. This is a nightly shot of mother sow and a couple of her young babies going into a trap at night with a camera that's mounted there. And the creative partners here were a massive volunteer effort that monitored for the pigs' presence, installed live traps, monitored the cameras, followed, and finally they were background checked, these volunteers, so they could be allowed to shoot the trapped pigs. The deceased pigs were given to families to eat, and between 2006 and 2017, we removed 110 pigs. Individual pigs may wander through Fort Ord occasionally, but we only trap them if they take up residence and start to cause damage. Our most creative partnership that we're very proud of is with a diverse pool of Monday through Friday volunteers, morning shifts, afternoon shifts. Each weekday, 2 to 6 volunteers walk in the door to work with us outside on all the projects we have going. One creative component Chris Hart's come up with is visiting university classrooms to inspire students to volunteer. When they do, BLM tries to check off as many skills as possible for each volunteer to learn, and to learn how to supervise others to learn that skill, so that each volunteer maximizes their resume building, in the case of these students. This is our version of a volunteer to career pipeline. Hundreds of volunteers and approximately 10,000 hours per year is the result. The partnership requires a lot of BLM staff time, but it greatly increases the work completed and the enjoyment for everybody in the workplace. This photo is with volunteers working with a CSU Monterey Bay class to collect some transect data. And this is some volunteers working with high school students to plant oaks to replace dead or dying oaks. We have a couple of special volunteer projects I want to highlight in ending this presentation, where Kathy Bell has voluntarily spent hundreds of hours photographing bobcats between 2004 and 2016. Kathy photographed and identified 45 different individual bobcats by their distinctive markings, either on their face or their legs or their tail. Anyway, at least we know that in that span of time, there were at least 45 bobcats. And the pictures that she came back with are wonderful to look at, and she's very generous in sharing her photos of bobcats. A couple of other volunteers, pretty special people, David and Jane Steyer, have been working for 15 years as volunteers and giving us about 55 hours per week in combination of the two of them. They've recorded 120,000 plant observation records. David has produced a book, The Flora of Fort Ord, which summarizes all the results of his years of effort. And they've provided hundreds of cookies to Army and BLM staff and volunteers. Here's Jane, known as the Cookie Lady, giving out some well-appreciated cookies. Lastly, I wanted to talk about California tiger salamander, where Robert Cooper at UCLA for his doctorate research has built 18 artificial vernal pools. Here are 12 of those 18. Each have different depths, so they hold water for different lengths of hydro periods. And the purpose is to try to find out if there's a certain hydro period, let's say 90 days as opposed to 150 days, that might give a selective advantage to the native tiger salamanders that are having a real onslaught of genetic pollution from the hybrid and non-native barred salamander. So as usual, we try to get as many people involved in these projects wherever they are. And there's Robert Cooper standing on the far right, and Joe Miller of the UC Natural Reserve on Fort Ord, who brought this class from UC Santa Cruz to the field trip. But if you look to the very upper left, there is a herd of 600 goats. So I think that's a pretty cool photo. All right, well, other than to say thank you for many people who have been our partners and hopefully will remain our partners in the future, that ends this kickoff presentation. And I hope that you've all enjoyed it, and I appreciate you hanging with me, for the entirety of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was a great kickoff presentation there, and thank you for addressing the hard to talk about, the elephant in the room, the BLM social justice stuff. So yeah, it's we need to talk about it and continue talking about it. And then all the stuff going on at Fort Ord, I forget how much. It's awesome. So many things, so many people, so many creative solutions and creativity. I love it. I love all the school kids and college kids and public and awesome volunteers out there.
Thanks, Thor. You were a big part of that, Thor, so thank you.
Oh, thanks.
And you're still out there in a different capacity, so you're still a big part of it.
Yeah, thank you. So at this time, folks and out there, if you have questions for Bruce, please use the Q&A, and Bruce could field some questions from you. Right now, the Q&A is empty. So, Bruce, there used to be all the sheep, and now there's the goats. What was the difference of number of sheep versus goats in the day? Do you need more goats or less goats to do the same job?
We use more goats than sheep, and more importantly, we often use these fence, electric fences every night, and a lot of times during the day. The goats are in electric fenced areas so that we can move them exactly where we need them the most. And when they've eaten it down to where we want, then we let them out of the fenced area. We didn't have that control with the sheep. So we're getting better results, more controllable results with the goats. They're a more thorough eater because they're stuck in a fenced area until we let them out. So they're not able to just ice cream, pick out those ice cream plants like the sheep used to do.
Cool. Hey, we got a few questions rolling in. Has the river fire near Salinas impacted any of your Fort Ord projects?
Well, we had to shut down the monument for about 6 days, so we spent most of our time keeping people out. But in a way, all that ash falling if it's enough of it, that's going to help enrich the soils. A lot of our soils are coastal sandy marine deposits, so they're pretty depauperate. And over the eons, fires have been happening and probably adding some nutrients to the soil. But in essence, really, no, not much impact at all that we could think of, other than for the people who couldn't go there for a while.
Okay, that question was from Jocelyn Curtis. Next question's Katie Gallagher. Where do you find most of your volunteers?
Most of our volunteers are CSU Monterey Bay students. The second most of our volunteers are groups of people that come throughout the year. These are high school, K through 12, special ed, colleges, some as far away as Vancouver. Sierra Club comes for a week. They bring about 10 volunteers for a week once a year. They'll be back in March. So we have a lot of groups coming in, and these volunteers from CSU Monterey Bay help to take on these groups so that they can learn how to supervise different ages and put that on their resume as well. Mostly they're from CSU Monterey Bay.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Here's a question from Greg Andrew, our past SERCAL president. He's asking, is there any one thing that can be done in restoration industry to increase diversity and opportunities for minorities?
Yeah, I think once you get them, you got to keep them. And the only way to keep them is to have a cultural environment where they feel comfortable. If it's Eurocentric and they're just stuck in it, it's like a fish out of water. It's probably not going to work. That was my example of, if you get an African American to join your team and it doesn't work out, you really have to question whether that team ever really included that person, or just tried to go about our normal ways, which might not relate very well for that person's sense of comfort. I was talking to a director of a local nonprofit, well known in Monterey County, about this. He said, yeah, we had a person of color on our board once and it didn't work out very well. It was really complicated. It's like, yeah, it's hard to work it out well unless you understand inclusivity. And most nonprofits, city councils, government agencies, they don't have a real inclusive atmosphere because they're from a different culture. So it's hard for them to understand how to be different, to be receptive for different people that don't see life the way that a dominant culture sees life. So it's a real tough one. But the one thing, if I could say anything, it would be to find ways to make your environment comfortable for people who don't share your identities.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. We are running out of time for more questions, so maybe you could answer some of these by typing the text on the Q&A during the next presentation for folks.
All right. Thanks, Thor. Thanks, everybody.
At this time, I want to transition into our first session of the conference, Managing Invasive Plants. And Bruce is going to put on his other hat to be session chair. And Bruce, you got a few presentations lined up for us.
Yeah, if Tom and Ashley and Emily can show their videos just so we can see your beautiful faces. We're going to launch into 3 different presentations. Ashley and then Tom and Emily. And Ashley's going to start off, and then doing so, she'll be talking as a senior restoration ecologist at WRA. She'll be talking about her evaluation of invasive weed approach to large-scale restoration. And then Tom talk about weed management areas, and Emily about Salinas River giant reed progress being done there. So thanks, Tom and Emily. We'll see you in a bit. And at this time, Ashley, we'll turn it over to you. And thanks, Ashley, for presenting for us.
Thank you, Bruce. That was a really wonderful presentation. So hopefully I can follow up well from that. Just give me one moment to share my screen. All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to be presenting at SERCAL and on this topic of invasive species management on large-scale restoration projects. So again, thank you to you all for being here, and thank you for SERCAL for inviting me to speak. I wish we could certainly be doing it in person in Monterey or wherever, but you know, hopefully soon I'll get to see all of you in person. But this is a topic I wanted to talk about. As Bruce said, I work in WRA, an environmental consulting firm based out of the Bay Area, and I'm a senior restoration ecologist. That's my background and my training. And I work predominantly on mitigation banking projects and other types of large-scale restoration. And for those of you that don't have as much familiarity with mitigation banking, typically we're restoring sites anywhere from about 100 acres to, I think our largest in the state now is about 4,000 acres. And almost every site we've worked on has had some challenges related to invasive species. And due to the scale of that, we've had to explore different approaches to help best utilize our resources that we have available to come up with the most effective projects that we can. So I just wanted to start off by just briefly touching on the scale of invasive species in California. I'm sure most of us here who work in the restoration field, and many of us are restoration practitioners, this is really no new information, or it isn't going to come as a surprise to anyone, but CalIPSI estimates that in California alone, $82 million a year are spent in direct costs on restoration, or excuse me, on invasive species monitoring, management, and outreach. And that doesn't include any of the indirect costs associated with impacts to things like agriculture or recreation or water supply and conveyance, which could easily total in the billions of dollars for our state. And so you can see some of the geographic spread of some of our worst invaders. This map on the left here, this is a map from CalFlora showing the distribution of Arundo donax throughout the state. And we can just see, any of us who have dealt with that species know how pervasive it is and what a difficult species it can be to manage. But also, the severity of the ecological impacts that this species can cause on our wildlands and again, to some of our other important sectors like agriculture and water conveyance. And even though invasive species are, a large-scale issue, both, financially and ecologically, of the about 1,800 non-natives that CalIPSI estimates we have in the state, only about 200 of them are listed as invasive. And I think at last count, maybe under 40 were ranked as highly invasive. So it's not necessarily a huge group of these species that are causing a large amount of the problems, but each one involves a different approach, different tools in the tool chest, and some can involve really a strategic approach to management because they can be really costly and difficult and require a long-term approach to actively manage. So one of the first things that I think is most important, particularly on large-scale projects like the mitigation banks that I work on, is choosing your battles wisely in terms of which species you're going to be trying to address on site. Is it all invasive species or just some, the most problematic? Are you going to be addressing it everywhere on site or just in key areas? And part of that really leads into considering what your project goals are. And this may seem somewhat obvious for those of us that deal in this industry, but I think it's very important to consider project goals because it can really shape how you utilize those resources. So for instance, in our mitigation bank projects, we have performance standards written into our project plans in terms of our restoration plans and our interim and long-term management plans that dictate what amount of invasive coverage we can have in our restored resources. So for us, that's usually wetlands, waters, riparian areas, and sensitive species habitats. A common metric is something like less than 10% absolute cover of CalIPSI ranked invasive species that we need to manage for. So knowing that can help us focus in our efforts on those restored resources and maintaining that level of cover. In the picture in the background, this is one of our sites up in the North Bay where we're doing seasonal wetland restoration that's actually going to be going to construction hopefully this month. Nearly the entire pasture land, it's currently grazed land, is Italian ryegrass. And, initially we were going to focus on treating the entire site, which we realized just would involve a ton of herbicide and was not terribly pragmatic or resource efficient. So now we're just focusing in on the actual restored and enhanced wetlands because those are what the project goals are really centered around, not really the upland grassland areas. Something else that I think is important to consider, when I was talking to other practitioners that I work with, there can sometimes be an attitude that we need to eradicate all non-native species on our sites because we're trying to restore this native habitat. And I think if we're honest about what our project goals are and what resources we have available, many of these non-natives are having minimal or really not much at all of an impact in terms of ecosystem function. So many of them we can kind of put to the side and focus the resources that we do have in terms of capital and labor and time on dealing with these more problematic invasive species. And in terms of what species are most problematic and what we should be focusing on, in my opinion, the ecosystem disruptors, as I call them, are the ones that we really would like to be spending our time and our effort and resources on. So as I showed on the previous slide, Arundo donax is one that we constantly battle on a lot of our riverine and riparian systems. And for those of you that worked on it, you could probably list the myriad issues that Arundo can cause in terms of ecosystem disruption, anywhere from creating monotypic stands that exclude native riparian species, to increasing fire risk, to stabilizing shifting channels, to increase water usage. So those are species that, even though they may be difficult to remove or manage, are worth the investment due to the benefits we get in ecosystem productivity. And again, thinking about limited resources, it's, oftentimes on these large scale sites, we may not be able to implement a management strategy or an eradication approach to the entire site just due to the scale of the site or the scale of the invasion. And so focusing on, key areas that are going to be able to limit the spread of the species within your site or off of your site onto adjacent properties, or reducing those deleterious impacts on important resources. It can be an important starting point for invasives management. So one of the topics that comes up frequently when we're discussing our restoration projects and how they interface with invasive management is, is irrigation working for us or against us? And really what we're thinking about is that extra water helping our natives that we're trying to establish more than the invasives, or vice versa? And in the example I'm going to get into in a second, we can see that it was a mixed bag. It was having some benefits for the natives, but causing a lot of issues with non-native plants that were working against us. And so in dealing with this issue in terms of our restoration sites, some of the questions that I've started asking myself are considering how we're irrigating. There are different ways to irrigate sites, and in California, it's often a necessity because of our arid climate to get some of our plants established. Without irrigation, some of these species in these sort of, for us, our wetlands and riparian areas may only establish on a, few year to decadal cycle. And, with our mitigation projects and even a lot of grant funded projects, we typically have a time frame of, a year to a few years to implement and do our monitoring and demonstrate success. So, we need that irrigation to sort of give us the kickstart to get our projects moving and to get our plants established. So things like overhead irrigation, can be less expensive and be more appropriate in certain circumstances, but can often end up watering your weeds more than, your desired plants. Whereas drip can work better for larger container plants, things like, oak plantings or riparian, potted plants. And it really just depends on what you're planting, where you're planting it, and what makes most sense for those species and the resources that you have. The seasonality of irrigation, are you going to be irrigating all year, or are you only going to be irrigating during certain seasons? This became one that was really important in the example I'm going to get into. And then where are you trying to establish plants, and what are you trying to establish? We find that in our riparian and our wetland areas that the areas that most need irrigation tend to be these sort of marginally dry areas. So sort of the edge of your riparian corridor, the wetland fringe that tends to be most sensitive to invasion from oftentimes annual grasses or invasive forbs that can utilize that extra water, but the hydro period isn't such that it excludes those invaders. So this is one of our mitigation properties in Southern California. This is the Peterson Ranch Mitigation Bank. It's in Eastern LA County, near the town of Palmdale and Lancaster, near Antelope Valley. And it's our largest bank. It's approximately 4,000 acres. And as you can see from the bottom left photo, it tends to be dominated by fairly dry chaparral and scrub. It's a very arid climate. There's also alluvial washes and some ephemeral streams running through the site. And one of the unique features is this rift valley that runs down the center of the Peterson Ranch property that historically supported these groundwater driven wetlands. And as part of our project, we were restoring ones that were no longer there and enhancing those that had been degraded. And so you can see one of those in the bottom left. And we were really looking to get a dominance of things like rushes and sedges in these wetlands, particularly species like Juncus mexicanus. And after grading and then installing a lot of wetland plugs and seeds, I believe too, we decided to go with overhead spraying and irrigation because it was more cost effective and it seemed more suitable to the scale of the plantings that we were doing and the fact that we didn't have these sort of large containerized plants that we could set drip emitters towards. And as you can see from the top photo in the quadrat and the lower right photo, we ended up just growing a beautiful field of mellolotus and native sunflower. And while neither of these are listed invasive species and maybe wouldn't ordinarily be something that we would be tackling, they became so dominant in the wetlands that they basically excluded all of our native rushes and sedges and other species we were looking to establish. So after the first year, we had to scratch our heads and think about, how are we going to address this issue in a way that made sense? And, we started by trying some herbicides and manual removal and control methods, but we were having trouble with them not being specific enough to the species we wanted to treat. And also, so we had some issues with herbicide drift. So these were not proving to be very desirable options, nor were they terribly effective. So what we ended up realizing was that we were watering all summer long and all winter long in an attempt to get our plants to put on as much growth as possible. We wanted this not only because we thought it would help our plants establish more quickly, but in mitigation banking, we often have a restriction on how long we can irrigate a site for. It typically ranges anywhere from a year to 3 years after restoration. And so in order to meet that requirement, we thought, oh, well, we really want to get our plants as much growth as possible before we have to stop the irrigation. But what we ended up deciding to do and what ended up being sort of the winning ticket for this project was only watering in what is California's naturally wet season. So, sort of the late fall and winter into early spring. And when we did that, we saw a major drop off in the amount of mellolotus and the native sunflower on site. And while our native plants we were trying to establish, a lot of the Juncus mexicanus, it may not have grown quite as fast, but it no longer had this intense competition from these other species. And it was able to persist through the drier summer because it was well adapted for that kind of hydrology. So that was something that we learned, and it ended up being a relatively simple fix and saved us from having to sort of beat our heads against the wall with herbicide treatments and other manual approaches. So in that vein of thinking about, maybe there are other non-herbicide management approaches that can be utilized in these larger scale settings, grazing, Bruce talked a lot about using, goats and sheep and cattle. That's something we often use on our mitigation banks. Many times the properties are already grazed for ranch production, and with some adjustments to the grazing density and how they seasonally graze the site, we can often harness that to help control a lot of the nuisance plants that we have on site. So that site up in North Bay with the Italian ryegrass, we're actually going to work with a grazer to help utilize cattle to keep the Italian ryegrass in the upland areas more under control and from becoming a fire risk or, you know, developing a lot of thatch and spreading seeds into our adjacent wetlands. You know, we talked about the hydrologic changes on Peterson Ranch, and then one we're exploring on one of my projects up in Colusa County is thinking about how shading through the development of canopy cover on some of our project sites can be useful in managing invasives, you know, in the long term. So that site, we're expecting it to develop into a closed canopy riparian forest. And so, you know, we expect to get some early weedy species on site, but we don't think that they're going to take a lot of management effort in the long term to control, because as those willows and cottonwoods and valley oaks and other riparian species we expect to develop there, they'll shade out a lot of these problematic species. And so understanding the succession and the development of the site can help us from using up energy and resources early on in the project that we wouldn't need to. But the last one I want to touch on here and in this photo is the use of fire, which is maybe not the most popular approach given everything going on in the state right now. I'm actually breathing in smoke from the Point Reyes fire right now, the Woodward fire. But this is a photo of a research project I worked on as an undergrad at UC Santa Barbara. This is a photo of a plot of land on campus called Lagoon Island that is historically coastal scrub. And the researcher I was working with was testing the effect of different fire regimes on removing invasive grasses and other species, and then restoring those coastal scrub communities. And what we found was that doing repeated fire activities, so, you know, multiple burns across, you know, 2 or 3 years, and then also increasing the heat intensity of the fire really had substantial beneficial effects when we went in afterwards and seeded or planted with the native scrub species. And what I think was particularly interesting about the intensity of the fire was because most of the plants on site during sort of the baseline condition period were annual grasses, they tend to burn through really fast and the heat doesn't penetrate into the soil very much. But what we did for the treatment was we collected a lot of Baccharis limbs that were around and other woody shrub species, and we piled those up and then burned those. And that helped the heat penetrate deeper into the soil profile and really helped deplete the soil seed bank of the invasive grasses. And so that ended up being a really effective approach. You know, I recognize it's maybe not suitable in all areas where we may have higher fire risk, but we worked with the local fire authorities to do this, and it ended up being a really good opportunity that was successful and reasonably easy to implement on the scale we needed. So that's something, you know, in the future, you know, restoring a more natural fire regime could be a good management tool on some of our wildlands. Something else that, jumping back to Peterson Ranch, you know, if you are going to use herbicides on site, something that we found to be really effective because we were going to be using them over a large scale was to do test plots of the different herbicide treatments that we wanted to try. Juncus mexicanus as a rush, we weren't entirely sure what it might be sensitive to in terms of broadleaf or grass selective herbicides. And so some of our contractor teams and our pesticide applicators, we worked with them to do these test plots, and we were able to find that the species was sensitive to some grass selective herbicides, but not others. And this way we knew when we were going to go out and spray around these species that we weren't going to inadvertently be killing our desired plants. So it ended up being a little bit of effort on the forefront, but gave us some long-term benefit. And if you are going to be doing these over large scales, I think it's definitely worth the little bit of effort on the forefront. And then finally, I just wanted to end sort of on a more positive note, because, you know, invasive species can be difficult to challenge, or can be a difficult challenge to manage, and can be expensive and time consuming. And this was sort of a positive story that came out of one of our sites. This one's also in Southern California near the Chino Hills area, SoCal Canyon. We were restoring purple needlegrass, so native bunch grassland on this site. And after the first year of seeding, we went out to the site, had our monitors go out to do vegetative sampling, and they came back and told us that they didn't find a single individual of stipa, which was pretty disheartening as a restoration practitioner. And so, we came together and we thought about, do we need to just sort of nuke the site and start over in terms of treating all the non-native annual grasses that had cropped up and then reseeding. But before we did that, we decided to go out and do another survey just to double check and to brainstorm a bit more if we had any other options on the table before we did that. And what we discovered was that actually there were many individuals of stipa on site. They were just teeny tiny, and they were so obscured with all of the thatch from the invasive annuals that my colleague ended up having to crawl around on his stomach basically and individually pin flag many of the individuals. And then what we ended up having to do, is shown in the left here, was we would have some of our management team go out and actually mow around those stipa so that they could grow. And really without too much trouble, we were able to show them what they looked like. And then they could deem for themselves, what were the native bunch grasses and what were the annual grasses. So it didn't necessarily involve that level of effort in the continual years of management. But I think the moral here is just don't necessarily give up on the natives too quickly. Most of our natives are pretty slow growing. And oftentimes we've seen where you get this almost exponential growth curve where for the first few years, they really don't do much. And then they really, if they get a foothold, then they really take off. And so during those first few years, it can easily be missed or be, discouraging, thinking that none of them made it when in this case, actually, we got quite a lot of them coming through. So that's my talk, and I'd be happy to answer questions for anybody that has some. And thank you all for listening.
All right. Great job, Ashley. Great job. We do have some questions. Lindsay asks that in her world, she's been talking about fire and tamarisk. Do you have any perspective on fire and tamarisk?
That's a great question. We haven't, I know one of our sites, the Peterson Ranch site actually had some tamarisk issues on adjacent land. And I can't remember if it was BLM land or it was public land, and we were worried about it coming into the site, but I don't think we ended up utilizing fire on that. But I know it has been utilized effectively to manage that species. And so if you have large swaths of it, I think it could be effective. It might not be as suitable if you've only got, individual patches throughout your site with native habitat that's maybe not fire adapted. But what was great about the sage community is that the species that we were trying to restore are adapted to some level of fire. So, we weren't concerned that any natives that were present wouldn't be able to recover.
All right, great, thank you. And then Joanna asks, what are the cons of herbicide that prompted you to non-herbicide management? And secondly, Joanna asks, have you had any success with mechanical mowing?
Yeah, so for the first question, one example that comes to mind is that site I mentioned. It's actually the same property as I'm showing in the picture here, the North Bay mitigation site. That site that we're doing the seasonal wetland restoration on is 120 acres. And so spraying over 120 acres would be a lot of chemical herbicide. And given that we had wetlands on site and we're adjacent to a perennial river, San Antonio Creek, that's listed habitat for steelhead, the potential to have that much runoff of herbicide going into these waterways and wetlands was something that we wanted to consider before we implemented such a large scale treatment. The other thing we have on that site is California red-legged frog. And so there's restrictions on what kinds of herbicides that you can use in areas that have red-legged frog populations. So we wanted to be sensitive of that fact. And that also limited, which herbicides we had at our disposal that also would be effective against the ryegrass. And so, we found that it was probably better all the way around to do a combination of managed grazing, sort of light grazing on the uplands and maybe some flash grazing around the wetlands as needed, and do spot treatments on the wetland fringes. We're also going to be doing these clump plantings of rhizomatous rushes and sedges to try to get that coverage as quickly as possible. So that was kind of our approach to reduce the negatives and boost the positives. And then your second question, I think, was about mechanized mowing. And so that last example was where we do mowing frequently out there around the stipa because it allows us to do that. And that's only over a few acres, so it's practical on that scale. You know, we're not going to be mowing 4,000 acres of grass. That's probably not realistic, and that's where, you know, grazing becomes a better option at that point. But I think for small targeted areas where you have to work around individual plants, that mechanized mowing can be really effective.
All right, thank you. Ashley, we do have another question, but if you could check that to answer it by typing your answer afterward, because it's time for our next presenter. And thanks again, great presentation, Ashley.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for taking in Ashley's presentation and asking those questions. We're now going to move to Tom Reyes. We saw Tom earlier. Tom is the Integrated Pest Management Coordinator with Mid-Peninsula Open Space District, and his talk will be on collaborative approaches to land management through the weed management areas. Tom, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Some great talks so far. So yeah, as Bruce mentioned, I work with Mid-Peninsula Open Space District. Just to be clear, I don't work as a part of the weed management area program in CDFA or anything. I'm merely a very active member of both the San Mateo weed management area and the Santa Clara weed management area, in addition to just being an advocate for collaborative land management. So my talk today is Blurring Imaginary Lines, Collaborative Land Management Through Weed Management Areas. Let's see here. All right, so just a primer on what weed management areas are. So they're quite simply, they're just a group of stakeholders who work on invasive plant management in a given area. So generally how those are structured in California are often on the county level, but there can sometimes be multiple counties together in a single WMA, or sometimes in just what makes geographic sense based on the landscapes that people are managing. And as I mentioned earlier, weed management areas are managed at the high level by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and they're generally managed locally by through the county agricultural commissioners' offices and sometimes the resource conservation districts. And in some cases, such as the Santa Clara weed management area, much of the coordination is actually done through one of the members, which is the Santa Clara Valley Water District. So it really is kind of a group effort between land management agencies, nonprofits, local governments, and even members of the public. And yeah, so throughout the state, there are 48 weed management areas, and no matter where you are in California, you are in the territory of a weed management area. And yeah, one of the most important parts of these is, you know, it's essentially just a collaborative framework. And then, you know, it's up to the people on the ground to actually make it effective and to make it really what it is. And one of the great things they do is provide grant funding, which helps incentivize collaboration and working together. So just a quick history about weed management areas. They're only about 20 years old. In 1999, the program was created by the Department of Food and Agriculture, and along with $5 million in funding. And with that, it essentially, it changed the Food and Agriculture Code to enshrine weed management areas into California law. So it's pretty exciting. Those first few years of funding were able to really, you know, organize and coalesce these groups to start talking to one another and start working on projects together. So yeah, in 2006, CalIPSI did a lot of advocacy work in order to get $1.5 million in annual funding, which is quite a bit of money for weed work around California. But unfortunately, in 2010, in our previous financial recession and budget crisis, all that funding got cut. So there were a number of years where funding got cut, and as a result, some of the weed management areas throughout California kind of fizzled out or became less active. There were a number of weed management areas, including San Mateo weed management area, that really throughout this whole, throughout the years where there was no funding, still kept up with regular meetings and still kept up that community seamlessly through today. So more recently, there's been some very good progress in terms of funding the weed management areas. So in 2018, CalIPSI helped pass the AB 2470, which established an invasive species council for the state, and also provided $2 million in grant funds, which were essentially awarded. I think it was 31 grants across the state, which was quite exciting. And I think that just that influx of money really did a lot to just to give a shock to the system and get people to start reviving their programs and whatnot. And yeah, so that funding has continued, and actually right now we are actually in the open period for the 2021 CDFA noxious weed grants program. So if you have any collaborative projects you want to get going, now's your time. Connect to your local weed management area, connect to some of your local partners, and they are awarding up to $32,000 for each county. So what I have here is a map of San Mateo County, in addition to a little bit over. There's also Santa Clara and Alameda and Santa Cruz County in there as well. But what I wanted to show you here is just the huge patchwork of different jurisdictions in any given area. In this, just in like in San Mateo County, for example, we have where I work, which is a regional open space district. We have county parks, there's state parks, there's national parks, there's land trusts, there's watershed lands, there's a huge amount of private lands in both timber and in rangeland. So there's just a huge patchwork of different jurisdictions, and the weeds and the wildlife really could care less about these imaginary lines that we've drawn across the landscape. And that's really why it's so important that we partner together to solve these things, because your neighbor's problem, as far as weeds go, is your problem too. So it benefits all of us to help our neighbors in the weed management world. So just looking at who the signatories are in the San Mateo WMA, and I am just going to be pretty much concentrating on San Mateo since it has been so well established and just kind of maintained over the years. So we have 18 signatories. It might actually be higher than that now. This slide's a year old, but yeah, 18 signatories from all kinds of different land management agencies, nonprofit agencies, land trusts, even some city governments, a wide variety of organizations. And in addition to that, we have 145 parties on the email list. So even the people who don't show up to our meetings on a bi-monthly basis, they still get our meeting minutes and can stay up to date on the progress and the resources that we share at our meetings. And really, pretty much any entity can join the weed management areas as long as they are working on weeds within that given area. And to sign, you pretty much promise what you will do, what you'll contribute to the group, and take it from there. So one of the parts of the structure of weed management areas are the steering committee. And the steering committee is essentially a subset of organizations or individuals that kind of help make some of the decisions, kind of help write things like the strategic plan, or decide which grant projects or which projects get forwarded on for grant applications and things like that. And the way it works is, there's a bunch of different roles based on what type of organization it is. Ideally, just so we can get a wide representation of the different weed managers and weed management needs in the given area. So there's a group from livestock production, agriculture, public lands, education, transportation, and all of these ideally are switched out from year to year so that everybody who's involved in the weed management area has a chance in helping run the weed management area. Another really important piece is the strategic plan. And so San Mateo Weed Management Area, we created our most recent strategic plan, I believe it was 2018. And this essentially lined out, what would we like to accomplish? And this list kind of helps guide us in the decision-making process when we're working together to decide which grants are going to be pushed forward for funding and things like that. And basically what we did is we split up the weeds in our area into different tiers. And so we have our priority 1, which are our eradication targets, and priority 2, which are our containment targets. And one really good thing about this is, just basically through this exercise, we've essentially created a short list of early detection species that we can just give this to everybody in the county and make sure that, we are all very concerned about these specific species. Basically, if any of us see these species on our lands, it's agreed that, we should probably do something about it. Yeah, and having this strategic plan in place was really very, very helpful when the last rounds of grants came around, simply because, basically, if we wrote our grants and they were in line with our strategic plan, it really showed that we've thought about this, and it just makes for a much stronger grant application. Another really important part of the weed management areas, and kind of one of my favorites, is just the community that's built through these things. I'm sure we all go to a lot of meetings, and many of those meetings I'm often wondering why I'm there. But something like the weed management area meetings are ones that I'm always looking forward to. I always walk away learning something new. It's one of the places that I can say scientific names or chemical names of herbicides and not have people's eyes glaze over, or at least not as many eyes glaze over. So it's really just a fun time. You can come and just kind of shoot ideas off of each other, ask people for advice, ask people on just anecdotes on, what they've been up to, especially things like COVID. It's been interesting to see how different people, different organizations are working with COVID and whatnot. And one event that's really exciting is the Picnic in the Weeds, which is an annual event put on by the San Mateo WMA. This year was unfortunately canceled due to everything, due to the state of the world right now. But it's essentially a show and tell where one of the members brings people out to their site, kind of shows them what they've been working on. And it's also just a great way to, you have pretty much all of the experts, all of the weed experts in your county at your site, where you can ask questions, you can get ideas, you can just brainstorm. So it's really has a lot of value. In addition to just being a great day. Last year we were on San Bruno Mountain with the city of Brisbane, which was quite exciting. Another really important thing about this is, basically not every signatory of the WMA is going to have, biologists or botanists or, invasive plant experts on staff, but many of them have a mission to manage invasive plants on their lands. So I'll use the city of Brisbane as an example. They're one of our most recent signatories, and they have a little bit of land that they wanted to do weed management on, and really just one employee who has a limited amount of time to work on this. So by coming to the weed management area meetings, and we were able to pretty much answer any questions he had, provide resources for him, make sure that, you know, it was as easy as it could be for him to start doing invasive plant management. And as I mentioned earlier, just looking at the map, you know, our neighbors' problems are our problems. So, so it's in everybody's best interest to make sure that our neighboring agencies are on top of their weeds as well. You know, as with anything, there's always challenges. And one of the challenges that we've had with the San Mateo weed management area is really just the involvement from the agricultural community and livestock production is fairly lacking. Most of the members, or most of the active members at least, are generally managing public lands or working with the public or things like that. So it's much more habitat restoration focused. So there's definitely room to expand that based if we were able to get more buy-in from our agricultural community. Yeah, and just talking about some of the other benefits, you know, really more than anything, just being able to build off of each other's work and not having to have, you know, 10 different agencies in a county duplicate their efforts. You know, instead we can build off of each other's efforts. You know, like me, I work for a public agency. All of our projects are funded with public money. So really our data and our reports, it all belongs to the public. So it behooves us to share that with as many people as possible. You know, kind of like open source collaboration. You know, I'd like to, you know, if we spent $100,000 in 2 years developing an EIR, you know, I'd like to share that so that then you have a good starting point. You can build off of that and then hopefully share that back, and, you know, we can kind of just keep improving. For any of you who were at Calypsy last year, there was you probably heard the phrase "steal with pride" quite a bit. That's kind of what that's getting at is really just building off of each other's work. Huge caveat to the steal with pride is that do not steal people's intellectual property. Make sure it's in the public domain or you have explicit permission. But yeah, there's just a lot of ways that we can leverage each other's work. And you know, that ultimately that just, for those of us who are using public funds to accomplish projects, you know, that does just make us better government, you know, by using public funds most effectively and most efficiently. We're not wasting public money that could be used on something else. So yeah, very important. There's also a lot of collaborative tools which are kind of you know, always developing more and more. So one thing that's really exciting, which is also essentially a collaborative development project, is CalFlora Weed Manager. One of the new features that just came online and is in active development is coordinating groups. And this is kind of perfect for sharing data among your weed management area. You know, pretty much everybody can have their own CalFlora groups, share into like the centralized weed manager coordinating group, and it just makes it a lot easier to share data between one another, be able to use, you know, shared reports. We could hopefully in the future we'll be able to, you know, spit out summaries of you know, all the weed treatment that happened in CalFlora. And yeah, I mentioned too, just CalFlora is really being developed by a bunch of different agencies throughout the state. So even CalFlora is being developed in a collaborative way. So it's quite exciting. And then especially too, once we have all of our data in like a centralized format, it opens up more tools to us, such as Whippet, which I'm not going to try to pronounce what the acronym means, but it's basically a prioritization tool for invasive plant projects. So yeah, a lot of potential with that. And ultimately, you know, it's this weed management areas and the collaborative model that that CDFA has provided through WMAs has been quite successful in treating weeds. You know, there's a lot of stats on what's actually been done. You know, they spent millions of dollars on weed management projects throughout the state, and you know, why can't we expand this to restoration or rare plant conservation? You know, sharing seeds or wildlife conservation. There's a lot of potential in expanding this model beyond just weeds. And this is definitely where I would give a strong shout out to organizations like One TAM up in the TAM Lands Collaborative up in Marin, where they are, you know, using a collaborative model to do many of these things. So yeah, quite interesting. Let's see. Yep, and with that, I'll open it up for questions. And yeah, thanks for your time, and looking forward to collaborating on weed management projects with you all.
All right, thanks very much, Tom. Good presentation. We do have time for a couple of questions, and Joanna asks, since you mentioned, Tom, the benefits of open source collaboration, open space would be all right too. Is there an archive of past WMA projects, techniques available to the public?
I mean, there's not that as far as I'm aware, there's not a centralized repository of past WMA projects and techniques. I know the CalIPSI website has been, you know, trying to house a lot of, especially as far as techniques go, and different strategies for managing different invasive plants. So that's a good place to look. And, you know, that's definitely somewhere where there's room for growth. You know, each WMA can provide their own, you know, create their own Google Drive or whatever to share resources. And then, you know, maybe we can just go up from there.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really good idea, Joanna. I hope that I'll take that to the Monterey County Weed Management area, because that's really a great idea. Bob Burns asked, where do your WA San Mateo meetings happen? And I think you mentioned they move around a little bit.
Yeah. So one of the good things about the San Mateo WMA meetings is that they actually do move around, so you don't have to be stuck in traffic every single meeting, maybe just half the meetings. So it basically switches. We have meetings every other month, and typically it's at the Resource Conservation District office in Half Moon Bay, and then also in the County Agricultural Commissioner's office in Redwood City.
All right. So you might want to check the Q&A box. There's at least one other question there, Tom, that maybe you can answer, type in your answer. And for everybody else, check out the Q&A box so that you can see the answered questions that you might not have heard live. All right, Tom, thanks again. Great presentation. All right, so now we're going to move on to the last presentation of the day. Emily Zefferman, who's a PhD ecologist with the Resource Conservation District of Monterey County, is going to present on the progress of passive restoration in former Arundo donax giant reed stands along the Salinas River. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all for being here and sticking with it till the end. I'm excited to talk with you today. And so yeah, my name is Emily Zefferman. I'm the ecologist with the RCD of Monterey County, and I am the project manager for the Salinas River Arundo donax control program. And today I'm going to be talking about 4 years of plant community monitoring data that get at the question of how passive restoration in former Arundo donax stands is going. So before I dive into some of the data, I wanted to give a little overview of our program as a whole. So just some background, the Salinas River is the longest river in the Central Coast region and the 4th largest watershed in California. And Arundo has invaded around 1,500 acres of the watershed. So you're all restoration practitioners. You've heard of Arundo, it's bad news, it grows really rapidly, uses a lot of water, creates problems for flooding, it's bad for wildlife, all bad, let's get rid of it. So here's a map showing Monterey County. The Salinas River runs all the way through the middle of the county for around 90 miles and empties into Monterey Bay. And in 2008 and 2009, the Monterey County Ag Commissioner began the Salinas River Arundo Control Program with some treatment of scattered Arundo and tamarisk in the upstream part of the river. And then the RCD took the reins and developed permits and secured funding to expand the program. And since 2014, we've been working our way downstream from King City to Soledad, where we're working today. By the end of this season, we should have around 750 total acres where we have initiated control that are under ongoing control. And just a quick overview of our methods. So in year one in the fall, we'll start by mowing large stands. We have these big mowers, they mulch the Arundo to the ground, and that is to help reduce biomass and to facilitate spraying the next year. Because what you'll see in this pair of photos, the one on the top shows what things might look like after mowing. And then in a period of months over the next spring, the Arundo will just grow back. And it's hard to tell the scale in this photo on the bottom, but this Arundo is probably about 10 feet tall. This was taken in July, shortly before treatments would begin. And so that's what we do in year two. We do an initial herbicide treatment, typically with power sprayers, and we use a glyphosate-based aquatic formulated herbicide for this. Here's a nice little before after of herbicide treatment. And then in year three, we will go back and treat any remaining resprouts that come up, usually pretty low cover at this point. And then we're using a glyphosate and a Mazapure herbicide mix for this. And just wanted to point out that there's some scattered tamarisk and tree tobacco throughout the watershed, so we are getting those as well. Our permits just cover woody plants. So to date, we have been primarily relying on passive forces to restore these areas and not really doing any active planting. And to a large extent, that is because of just the scope of this project. It's over so many miles of river. Again, at the end of this year, we should have about 750 acres that we're working on. It'd be very expensive to go out there and try to replant all these areas. We're also dealing with dozens of different private property owners. It's very hard to get irrigation out to these sites. And then there's just a lot of threats to the plants out there. There's herbivores. The Salinas River is a very flashy system. It can cause flooding and drought in different years. So it's a very harsh environment to get plants established. But the big question that I'll be focusing on in today's talk is, how is this going? Is it succeeding in the way that we want it to? Obviously, what we would like to see is more natives moving back into these former Arundo-dominated areas. And we are seeing some examples of this. These are some photos showing that. But we are also seeing a lot of examples where former Arundo stands are becoming these poison hemlock or perennial pepperweed or other weed dominated areas. So these are not exactly what we'd like to see. But that's just kind of anecdotal, and really wanted to get a little more quantitative with this and assess on a larger scale, you know, how is this passive restoration working out overall? So I designed a plant community monitoring study, and this is getting at kind of three big questions. One is just how effective is our Arundo treatment? So looking at those decreases in Arundo over time. Also, how are the plant communities in former Arundo dominated areas changing over time? Are they slowly becoming more dominated by natives and maybe woody species, or are the non-native species kind of suppressing the natives? And then also wanted to look at whether the surrounding communities around these former Arundo sites are influencing what's coming into those sites. So are the Arundo dominated areas becoming more similar to the nearby non-Arundo invaded sites? So here is kind of a description of the study design. This is a section of river in this larger map on the right that is the target area for this study. And you can see the Arundo is shown in yellow. And then I selected randomly 11 large Arundo patches that were mowed all in the fall of 2016, and those selected patches are shown in blue. And then if you look kind of at this middle diagram, this shows the design where we have in each patch, there's 2 transects inside the Arundo patch, and then 2 transects outside the Arundo patch, which we're sort of considering controls in this study. And each transect is a belt transect. It's 2 meters wide and 25 meters long for a total of 50 square meters in area. And within each of these transects, we are taking data on just a species list, all the species that are present at the site, the Arundo cane density, so the number of live Arundo canes that are remaining at the site, and percent cover of a number of different things. So obviously looking at Arundo, but also looking at native and separately non-native species in 3 different guilds. The graminoids, which in this system are primarily grasses, but also some sedges and rushes, herbaceous species, and woody species, as well as bare ground. So our first surveys were done in spring 2017. This was after the first year of mowing. And then in the second year, we surveyed again in the spring. This is after the initial herbicide treatment. And then survey 3 occurred after the first herbicide retreatment, or the second herbicide treatment. And then between surveys 3 and 4, we did not have any treatment between these periods. And before I get into showing some graphs and data analysis, I just wanted to give kind of a visual of what some of this looked like. These are some photos of some control transects, just to give a sense of the variety of plant communities that were outside of the former Arundo areas. So on the left, you can see there's some sandbar willow and kind of a mixed open and woody terrain. And then on the right here, we have perennial pepperweed and pretty much a monoculture. And then typically we'll see, like what's on the left here, we have some coyote brush mixed in with some poison hemlock, so kind of a combination of native and non-native species. And then we have also some areas, as shown on the right, that are just kind of open, pretty open grassland. And now here's a time series of an Arundo transect that we monitored these 4 years. This is what I would consider a good example, something like what we would kind of like to see. So 2017, this is after mowing. You see the regrowth here of the live Arundo. And then 2018 is after the first spraying. Things look pretty nuked. But in 2019, you see some shrubs start to come back, some little native things going on there. And then in 2020, a little bit more. So staying pretty open, but it's a lot of native species, some weeds, but not too bad. This is good. But then we're also seeing a lot of examples that look more like this, where maybe the first 2 years kind of look similar to the other transect, but 2019, we start to get some poison hemlock coming in, and then by 2020, it's just this dense, almost monoculture of hemlock. So that's not what we would like to see. So let's look at some graphs. I'm super excited to show these to you. This has all just been done recently, and I have to give a big shout out to Sarah Gaffney, who is a PhD candidate at UC Davis, who's been collaborating with me on the data analysis, and she produced all the graphs that I'll be showing you. And she is actually giving a talk on Thursday in the grassland ecosystem section, so make sure to check that out. Okay, so looking at all these data averaged, first let's take a look at Arundo cane density. So again, 2017, this is after mowing before spraying. We're starting with around 500 canes per 50 meter square transect area. And we see this huge decrease, 98% decrease in, on average, of live canes after the first herbicide treatment. And for the next graph, I'm going to be focusing in on these 3 years because it's just scale. You can't really tell what's going on in this graph. So that we'll zoom in on those. And so you see after the second herbicide treatment, we're also getting another decrease, about a 74% decrease in canes, going from around 9 per 50 meter square transect, which is pretty low, but down to just a little over 2 on average. And then importantly, between 2019 and 2020, we don't see a change, but this is, if you recall, where we didn't do any treatment. So that's actually good, because I was a little bit worried that we might start to see an increase if we didn't do a treatment. So this kind of is informing our management, and so we'll probably, after the 3rd year, start to alternate years in terms of going back and continuing to retreat. Okay, so looking at percent cover data, I'm going to show a few graphs like this. So just to kind of orient you first, we have the Arundo transects shown on the left, and these are compared side by side to the controls on the right. And we're looking at percent cover of a number of different things. So first, let's take a look at Arundo, which is this red line. This is percent cover. Shouldn't be a big surprise. It kind of mirrors that cane density data. And then for natives, this black line here, we are seeing a little bit of an increase, pretty low cover, but some slight increases over time. So that's good. But what is really striking is just this huge increase in total non-native cover over time. And when you compare this to the controls, you can see that also in the controls, the non-native species are dominating. There's some natives too, and interestingly, they're kind of increasing as well over time, as are the non-natives in the controls. And I think that what's going on there is just recovery from the drought. We had this big dieback prior to 2017, and now things are kind of starting to recover. So kind of breaking down, that was looking at total non-native and native cover. This is breaking it down by guild. So you can see in the Arundo transects that all 3 guilds, the graminoids, herbaceous species, and woody species, are increasing over time, and they're all at about the same percent cover by 2020. Whereas in the controls, you can see all these guilds are also increasing, but woody species are really dominant. And so what will be interesting to see over time is whether these Arundo transects, whether we'll continue to get some of this increase in woody cover over time. And I know a lot of you are plant nerds, you probably want to know what species we're actually seeing. So this is just a list of the top species in the Arundo transects versus the control transects based on how commonly they were found in a transect. So it's not necessarily the most abundant, but just more like the most widespread. So if they were found in all of our transects versus only 1 or 2. So there's actually quite a lot of overlap between the Arundo and controlled transects in terms of the species. One thing that I wanted to point out here was this sandbar willow, which is pretty common in the control transects, but we're really not seeing willows coming back at all in our Arundo transects. And I think that this has to do probably with the thick layer of mulch that's remaining in those sites. Willows, for germination anyway, like to have that nice open mineral soil. So I think that could probably be why we're seeing some of that. Okay, so taking a look now at non-native percent cover in the Arundo transects versus the controls. Again, this is just the Arundo line in red. And in the Arundo transects, what we can see is that the non-native cover is really driven by herbaceous species. That's this yellow line. They're really dominating, and we are getting increases in grass cover for the non-native species, but not quite as much as the herbaceous species. But what's interesting is in the controls, it's the opposite. The grasses, it's really the non-native grasses that are dominating and that have been increasing over the past few years, while their herbaceous non-natives have actually been decreasing a little bit. And I don't really have a good explanation for this, but I think this also might have to do with the Arundo mulch and maybe some differences in soil moisture. The mulch is kind of holding in some of the soil moisture, or maybe just because of the seeds of some of the more dominant species can establish better in the Arundo mulch, like the poison hemlock seems to do really well. So I'd be interested in hearing some of your thoughts on that too, if you've experienced things like this. So again, just looking at non-native species based on how commonly they're found in a transect, between the non-natives or between the Arundo transects and the controls. Again, there's some overlap, but there's a little more differences here. And something that I thought was interesting is that the species we find in the most Arundo transects, which is poison hemlock, doesn't even make the top 7 in the controls. And then the species that we're finding the most commonly in the controls didn't make it on the list, the top list for the Arundo transects. So that's kind of just an interesting thing, and it shows us that these communities really are different. And so this is a bit of a complicated graph. This is actually showing two different graphs showing the same data, and I don't have a lot of time to run through it in detail, but basically the take-home message from this is that we're looking, this is the non-metric multidimensional scaling, or kind of an ordination of species composition. So comparing just what species we're finding in the Arundo sites versus the controls over time. And you can see it probably most clearly in this graph on the right, where the Arundo transects from 2017 are shown in red, from 2020 shown in yellow, and they're distinct from the controls, which are shown here in blue and in green. So we're not seeing this kind of merging of communities that you might expect as species from the controls start to move into the Arundo sites. So just getting back to our original questions, how effective is our Arundo treatment? Pretty effective. That's been really nice to see. We still have work to do. We would like to get to eradication. We don't know how long it's going to take yet, but we're well on our way. How are the plant communities in the former Arundo dominated areas changing over time? We are seeing an increased cover of natives a little bit, but a much greater increase in non-natives, especially herbaceous species. So we'll be keeping an eye on it to see how they do. And our former Arundo dominated areas becoming more similar to the nearby non-Arundo invaded sites. Not yet, we don't have a lot of evidence of this, but that again may continue to change over time. Again, if we get a big flood going through, that could change things, or another drought. So it'll be interesting to kind of keep an eye on these sites and see what happens. So again, going back to this question, well, what about active restoration? When I see all these weeds, I'm like, maybe we should be going out there and doing some planting. We tried a little bit in mid-January 2019, had fairly low success with survival. And we're going to be trying again this year, just another little pilot study with some seed and plugs. We're going to try to plant them earlier in the season to give them a little bit more of a head start and just hope for the best. And I would really love to hear from some of you if you've attempted restoration projects in similar conditions where we're kind of just putting things out for the elements and see if you have any tips and advice. So I want to thank my collaborators who made this all possible, and especially the funders, particularly the Wildlife Conservation Board, who's funded the majority of this work. And I'm a little over time, so just gonna go straight to any questions and comments. So thank you all for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Emily. And we do have several questions. One is from Lindsay, who says that she's noticed in very dense stands of Arundo, the native seed bank can be limited, in particular if the area is not engaged regularly with the floodplain. So she's just wondering about seed supplementation, perhaps broadcasting seed from local sources.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to try this year on kind of a small scale, just to see how it works. We're going to be collecting some seed actually tomorrow from out there. So trying to get some local sources, as well as we'll probably order some seed, and just to see, because it's a little unclear right now what's even able to establish in the mulch. We might have to do a little bit of raking to try to get the seed down into the soil. But yeah, we'll be trying some things out, because it would be really nice if we could just, help nudge things in the right direction.
Great. Yeah, my thought is that if you're swamped with poison hemlock or some other quite abundant weed, seeding or planting may be best wait until you've got the non-native out of that jungle scenario, which is really hard to compete with. But yeah, good luck. You're doing a lot of great stuff there. Lindsay was wondering what the past land use was prior to the Arundo growth, because she's wondering if there's a chance that the seed banks are different in the Arundo versus the non-Arundo area.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I think a lot of these areas out in the river may have been farmed at one point. The river moves a lot, and a lot of times when the river moves away from a farm edge, they'll start kind of, farming in towards the river, and then the river moves the other way and they'll back off a little bit. So because basically the river is entirely flanked by ag fields. So there's some of that history, but I think, yeah, we're talking about this amongst coworkers recently, just why is it that things are where they are? And there's pretty much a mosaic. So the Arundo is pretty patchily distributed throughout the riparian corridor, and it might have to do with elevation a little bit, but certainly some of these sites might be have been affected by various land management practices.
All right. Well, there's a lot more questions than we have time to get to. We'll take one more, but Emily, it'd be great if you went into the Q&A box as soon as you're done and tried to answer these questions by typing the answers in, really good ones. But let's take at least Shannon's question as the last question. Do you have any plans, Emily, to address the Arundo mulch?
Nope. Nope, it's there to stay. I think for our planting, we would kind of try to use it for our advantage, and make little holes in it to plant plants. It's pretty variable in how thick it is. Sometimes it's just like an inch. Sometimes it's maybe 6 or more inches. So yeah, for now it's just slowly decomposing over time.
Well, thanks again for answering those questions and for the presentation, Emily. And hopefully all those questions in the Q&A box can be answered. But it's time for us to turn it back to our illustrious hosts and organizers, Julie St. John and Thor Anderson. Thanks to all the presenters today. It's been a really good session.
All right. right. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Emily, Ashley, and Tom. Those were great. Thanks for kicking us off for the first virtual conference for SERCAL. I really enjoyed it. We had great attendance, and from my perspective, we peaked at 115, and we stayed really stable around 108, 110 throughout all the presentations. So kudos to you guys and holding in there. Folks who are attendees and want to stay for the meet and greet with Burleson, please don't leave, stay logged in. And after we close up here the formal session, we will be inviting you over from attendees to panelists to have a Zoom-like meeting conversation. You could ask Burleson consultant staff any question you want. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I think it went great. Julie, I think you might have some announcements.
Yes, I do. Just a second. I'm going to share. Okay, and I actually want this to be full. Sorry, everyone, I'm doing this for the first time. Okay, so Thor doesn't know that I was going to do this, but this was him dreaming about the conference back in 2019 at one of the field trip